Joining us again now, Lord Mandelson, the Business Secretary. Lord Mandelson, the Germans clearly, A, want us to accept a bit more blame and feel a bit more guilty, but B, perhaps much more importantly, given that 100 billion of this $1.1 trillion dollars of money is going to come from the European Union, it'll be German money, some of it, he doesn't want to burn it.
And is anyone going to ask him to burn it? I'd like to make 2 points about the big picture on this, John. The first is that Britain is an open economy. We are totally connected to and dependent on what happens in the rest of the world and the global economy. A boost for the global economy means a boost for our economy as well. But secondly, if you look at what's happened to the banking and the financial system that's landed in the mess that we're in now, you have to understand that it is not possible simply to fix what's gone wrong nationally. It has to be put right internationally. And we embarked on that course today at the G20. And I have to say, the bulk of the credit for that goes to the British Prime Minister. And I think quite deservedly, he got the ovation he did from the other world leaders at the end of the meeting.
Well, I want to come back to that international action in just a moment. But just this question of the money that is going to be made available through the IMF to the emerging economies. I mean, clearly your hope is that the British taxpayer will be a direct beneficiary of this because trade will move, demand will stir, and so it's going to be an indirect stimulus to the British.
For the reasons I've explained. We are totally connected
but that
with
could
what
take
goes
weeks,
on in the rest
if not
of the world.
months.
Look, John, what we're seeking is an increase in global output, in global growth by 4%. By the end of next year. That is what all these mobilization of resources and targeted measures are about. And yes, the emerging economies are fantastically important. Over the last 10 years, 70% of global growth came from the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils and the other emerging economies of this world. If they falter, if they fail to be the same sort of drivers of global growth in the coming years, as we have seen them performing during the last 10, then we will pay the price for that in this country in terms of British jobs, British livelihoods and British businesses.
That's fully recognised, but any idea that this summit has suddenly saved a lot of jobs right now, there's still going to be a dip during which an awful lot more people will fall out of work.
But our task is to build our way and invest in the recovery that we need to get us out of the recession, which is attacking British jobs and British businesses. And we will only do that successfully if we manage to get the global economy as a whole raising its game and increasing its performance, increasing the demand for our goods and services, which provide for our jobs here at home.
Well, one of the key things which seemed to emerge, and I was down there today and around last night as well, is that there's no evidence that any single jurisdiction, national jurisdiction in terms of regulation, has ceded any sovereignty to anybody when it comes to peering in to see what you're doing in terms of regulating banks, hedge funds and the rest. How is a global regulatory structure going to occur?
No, I think two things have happened. One is there will be new international rules, standards, which banks and lending institutions, financial institutions in each jurisdiction will have to comply with. And so national regulators will be having to comply with international standards in how they regulate what goes on domestically.
And who will make them?
And there is now an international financial stability board, a way in which regulators can talk to each other and join up their actions and provide some proper supervision of what national regulators can do in a way that hasn't taken place before. Now,
well, let's take an example. Let's be concrete.
Let me just make this point, though. That is not going to be put in place overnight. Before you invite me on Channel 4 News next week and say, why hasn't it all been created? It is a process that we have launched today, but it's a very, very important
I can present you an example which you can address. AIG, we discovered this week that actually was regulated in France, that it was governed by the Banque de France, and it had about 10 employees in their headquarters in France, and all its work and all the filth and the mess flowed here in London. How is that going to be prevented next time round?
And do you know what the problem was? That the national regulator, in France in this case, but you could say the same, I'm afraid, about our regulator in relation to other financial institutions in our own country, simply were not tough enough, they weren't intrusive enough, they weren't challenging enough, and that's got to change.
But will it?
Yes, it will.
Lord Mandelson, thank you very much indeed for coming in. In Washington now is Simon Johnson, former chief economist with the IMF. Simon Johnson, this is an extraordinary day for the IMF because this is a vast injection of money. A, is the IMF up to dealing with it? B, will it work?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is the IMF's day, and it's a huge change from a year ago when the G7 and the emerging markets said the IMF's irrelevant and they were cutting the IMF's budget massively, and the IMF had to lay off staff. Can the IMF handle it? I don't know. I think they need to get some of the staff back, to be honest. I think the budget cuts that were pushed through last year were inappropriate, ill-timed, and need to be reversed. It's all right to give them money, but they need the people. It's about skilled people. There's a lot of diplomacy to be done. There's a lot of analytical work to be done, and the IMF has fallen behind because they've been kept so short of resources. I think I applaud the G20's move today, but they've got to complete the package. They have to give the IMF the ability to do the job.
OK, let's just assume for a moment that given there are plenty of bankers washing about out there who might be able to help in this matter, let's take it that you get the staff. Then this 1.1 trillion, how quickly could it be made to feed through into these emerging economies and actually save countries like Hungary, for example?
Well, it's $1 trillion for the IMF, in and around the IMF. It's $100 billion for the other multilateral development banks, much of which will go to the World Bank. And the answer on how quickly you can get the money in play is very fast, actually, particularly on the front lines in Eastern Europe, as you're indicating. But there's also, I would stress, countries in Western Europe, in the Eurozone itself, who need preemptive lines of credit from the IMF. They need to sort out some of their economic policies. They need to get some breathing space. And big loans from the IMF are going to be an important part of that for, I'm talking about Greece, I'm talking about Ireland, we may be talking about Spain, and we may be talking about Italy. I'm completely serious, and I think the G20 has got this message.
Might you even be talking about UK PLC?
Well, I didn't want to be too forward with that, but yes, I might be.
Do you actually think that some of this money might come direct to Britain?
Well, I think the idea is that IMF loans are different from the past. In the past, you got an IMF loan when you were absolutely desperate, as the UK was in the middle of the 1970s. Now, the IMF is trying to reach out to countries with very, very big loans, okay, much bigger than before, before you get into trouble. And the point is that's the time to turn your policies around. And with all due respect to Gordon Brown and his ministers, they need some help right now. Your economy, the UK economy, is in big trouble. And I'm not saying that, the IMF is the magic bullet, but I think the IMF, the G20 is saying, and the G20, of course, is a force mobilized by Gordon Brown for early warnings and for coming in before it's too late. The IMF is telling you that, the IMF is offering, let's say, to be part of the solution rather than the part of the problem for all countries. And Europe is the place which really needs this assistance right now.
Previously, the IMF has moved in when countries go bust. This seems to presume that in some way the IMF could be proactive, spot trouble in the early lines and say, right, we're coming in.
Well, the IMF always spots trouble early on. I can assure you that those messages are not well received by the people in power, and the IMF is not welcomed. What the G20 is trying to do, and I think this is very much the initiative from the Obama administration, is give the IMF so much money, so much financial firepower, they can actually come in and give you a really big loan, not on a zero conditions basis, but on some pretty reasonable conditions that give you some breathing space, that allow you to ride through a big housing price collapse, for example, and some fiscal adjustment going to have to make. So these won't be the tough programs of the IMF of the old days, which didn't have that much cash, so they had to really force you or help you force a fast adjustment. This can be a gentler, easier IMF, different strategy, a lot more money, but you've still got to get serious about sorting out your own economic house.
Simon Johnson, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. As you're still here, Lord Mandelson, I don't mean to bounce you, but he did say, something could even come here.
Well, I don't think that we're going to be top of the queue for IMF resources, but I think he makes an incredibly important point here. We are destigmatizing going to the IMF. And you've already...
Decalahanizing.
Well, you've already heard Mexico today saying they're going to draw on these reserves and these special drawing rights that are being created. Now,
there's no shame in going to the IMF anymore.
Previously, it was a bit embarrassing. It was sort of slightly shameful to be going to the IMF. That, I think, is being eliminated from the new approach that has been put in place today, and I think it's very,
there would be no shame in Gordon Brown going if it had to be done.
John, I don't think we're going to be at the top of the queue, as I said.
Well, you didn't say we wouldn't be in the queue, though.
I don't think we'll be in the queue either. But look at the seriousness. Look at the seriousness of this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely right. In some countries in Central and Eastern Europe, there is quite some distress, and it is true that some of the resources that have now been invested in the IMF will need to be targeted in Europe, but not Europe alone.
Lord Mandelson, Simon Johnson again, thank you both.